Widowed cowboy saves native baby. 24 hours later, the tribe returns. The silence on Jacob's ranch wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a predator. It stalked the canyons of his memory, devoured the echoes of laughter that once filled his small cabin, and left behind nothing but the brittle bones of what used to be. For 3 years, since the fever had stolen his Sarah and their infant son Daniel, the silence had been his only companion, a shroud he pulled over his soul. His world was a landscape of dust and ghosts, a purgatory of his own making on 100 acres of unforgiving Texas soil. He worked from can't see to can't see, not for profit but for exhaustion, hoping to earn a few hours of dreamless sleep. Each sunrise was a judgment, each sunset a bitter confirmation of his solitude. He was a man hollowed out by grief, a walking echo in a life that had lost its voice. Today the silence was different. It felt thin, brittle, stretched taut over something new. Jacob was riding the southern fence line, the sun a merciless hammer overhead, when his horse, a stoic mare named Daisy, shied violently. She danced sideways, her ears pricked, her nostrils flared. Jacob's hand went instinctively to the worn stock of the Winchester in his saddle scabbard. He followed the mare's gaze to a thicket of mesquite and prickly pear. At first he saw nothing but shadow and thorn, then a flicker of movement. Not the furtive dash of a coyote or the slither of a snake, it was something else. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the parched earth, the Winchester now held ready in his hands. He moved with the quiet, predatory grace of a man who lived with threats, both seen and unseen. The air was still, heavy with heat and the smell of dry dust. As he drew closer, he heard it, a sound so alien in his world of silence that it took his mind a moment to place it. It was a cry, a weak, mewling cry, like a kitten, but unmistakably human. His heart, a cold, dormant stone in his chest, gave a painful lurch. He pushed aside a thorny branch, and there, nestled in a small, hastily made bed of dry grass and leaves, was a baby. It was wrapped in a piece of buffalo hide, decorated with intricate faded beadwork. Its skin was the rich red-brown of the Comanche who sometimes hunted these lands. It was tiny, its face squenched and red from crying, its small fists batting at the air. It was alone, utterly and completely alone. Jacob scanned the area, his eyes sweeping the horizon, searching for any sign of life. He saw nothing, no tracks but those of a lone woman's moccasins, already being erased by the wind, leading away from the thicket, and then vanishing into the rocky ground to the east. And beside the vanishing tracks, the faint, ominous prints of a large cat. A mountain lion. The story wrote itself in the dust. A mother, likely tracked, had hidden her child in a desperate, final act of love, hoping to lead the predator away from it. She had sacrificed herself for her baby. Jacob stood there, the Texas sun beating down on him, the baby's cries growing weaker. He was a man who had sworn off feeling, who had buried his heart with his wife and son. The world and its sorrows were no longer his concern. He could ride away. He could leave the baby to its fate, to the will of a cruel God and a crueler land. It was the Comanche way, perhaps, a harsh but necessary calculus of survival. It was not his fight. But then the infant's dark, almond-shaped eyes opened and seemed to lock on him. They were not Sarah's blue eyes, or Daniel's hazel. They were the eyes of a stranger, a child from a world that saw him as an enemy, but in them he saw the universal, desperate plea of all life, to live. He thought of Daniel, his Daniel, silent and cold in his small cradle. He thought of Sarah's last ragged breath. He had been helpless then, a bystander to the quiet violence of disease. He was not helpless now. To turn his back on this child would be to turn his back on the last, flickering ember of his own humanity. It would be the final death of the man Sarah had loved. The lonely, widowed cowboy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He leaned the Winchester against a rock, knelt down, and with hands that trembled for the first time in 3 years, he gently, so gently, lifted the crying baby from its thorny cradle. The silence of his life was over, and a war he did not want was about to begin. The baby was impossibly light in his arms, a fragile bundle of warmth and desperation. Its cries softened to a weak whimper as Jacob held it against the rough canvas of his coat. the contact, the simple human warmth seemed to soothe it. He looked down at the small, perfect face, the dark tuft of hair, and felt a pang so sharp, so resonant of his own loss, that it almost brought him to his knees. This was a pain he knew intimately, the pain of a parent's love, fierce and boundless, staring into the abyss of loss. The mother's sacrifice was a living thing here, a palpable presence in the oppressive heat. He had to honor it. Cradling the infant carefully in one arm, he retrieved his rifle and remounted Daisy. The mare, usually stoic, was nervous, her scenting the lingering trace of the predator that had passed this way. Jacob nudged her into a slow, careful walk, his body angled to shield the baby from the jarring motion of the horse. The ride back to the cabin was the longest of his life. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a cry. His mind, a place he usually kept locked down and empty, was a whirlwind of frantic, practical thoughts. What did a baby eat? How did you clean it? He had been a father for 6 short, beautiful months, but the knowledge felt a lifetime away, buried under a mountain of grief. It was Daniel's memory that guided him. He remembered Sarah, her gentle hands, her soft voice humming as she cared for their son. He tried to recall the small, crucial details: milk, warmth, cleanliness. He reached the cabin, a lonely sentinel in the vast emptiness, and slid from the saddle. The baby had fallen into a restless sleep, its small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Inside, the cabin was still and cool, smelling of wood smoke and old sorrow. It was a man's space, stark and functional. There was nothing soft here, nothing gentle. Jacob laid the baby on his own rough-spun blanket on the bed, creating a small barricade of pillows around it. First, food. He had a neighbor with a milk cow, but that was 5 miles away, a journey he couldn't risk with a child so fragile. He remembered a can of condensed milk he'd bought months ago on a whim, thinking it might be a luxury. He found it in the back of the pantry. A godsend. He mixed a small amount with boiled, cooled water in a tin cup, his large, clumsy hands struggling with the delicate task. He had no bottle. He tore a strip from one of his few clean shirts, rolled it into a wick, dipped it in the sweet, milky water, and gently touched it to the baby's lips. The infant stirred. Its mouth, a perfect tiny bow, latched onto the cloth, and it began to suckle, weak but determined. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed, feeding the Comanche baby, drop by precious drop, a feeling of profound, terrifying responsibility settling over him. This small, helpless life was now entirely in his hands. He was its only hope. As he tended to the child, a new awareness dawned. This was not just a baby, it was a Comanche baby. Its people would be looking for it. They would follow the mother's tracks, and they would find the signs of the mountain lion. But what would they believe when they found the tracks ended and the baby was gone? They would see his tracks, the tracks of a white man, leading away. The conclusion they would draw was as inevitable as the setting sun. He was a thief, a kidnapper. He had not just saved a life, he had stolen a child. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool air in the cabin. The Comanche were a proud, fierce people. They valued their children above all else. They would not rest. They would not forgive. He had, in his act of mercy, declared war on an entire tribe. He looked down at the sleeping infant, its belly now full, a look of peace on its small face. He had bought it a few more hours of life. But what was the cost? His own life? A bloody conflict that would stain this land red? He had no answers. He only knew that he could not have done differently. He had chosen to act, to care, and he would face the consequences. For the rest of the day and into the night, he watched over the child. He was a sentry at the gates of a life. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft sounds of a baby's breath, a sound that both healed and broke his heart. He was a father again, if only for a few stolen hours. He did not sleep. He sat in his chair, the Winchester leaning against the wall, and waited for the dawn. He knew, with a cold certainty, that it would bring a reckoning. The sun rose the next morning, painting the eastern sky in brutal strokes of orange and red. It looked like a fresh wound. Jacob was exhausted, his body aching from the long vigil, but his mind was unnervingly clear. The night had sharpened his senses, honed his resolve. He had made a choice, and now he had to live with it, for however long that might be. The baby woke with a small cry, and the cycle of care began again. Feeding, cleaning, the clumsy tenderness of a man relearning the language of fatherhood. He found himself talking to the infant, his voice a low, rough murmur, the words rusty from disuse. He told it about the ranch, about Daisy, about the way the light hit the canyon walls at dusk. He told it things he hadn't spoken aloud in 3 years. He was speaking to the child, but he was also speaking to the ghosts in the room, to Sarah and Daniel, seeking their approval, their forgiveness. Around mid-morning he took the baby outside, needing to feel the air, to see the vastness of his domain, his prison. He sat on the porch step, the baby cradled in his lap, a small patch of shade his only refuge from the growing heat. The world seemed unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. And then he saw it. On the northern ridge, a place where the sky met the earth, a single rider appeared, a dark silhouette against the bright sky, then another, and another, until the entire ridge was lined with them. Perhaps 20 or 30 men. They were too far to see clearly, but he didn't need to. He knew who they were. They sat on their horses, motionless, watching him. They were not attacking, they were assessing. An army of judges on a distant hill. The baby in his lap stirred, blissfully unaware of the silent verdict being passed down upon its protector. Jacob's blood ran cold. This was it. The reckoning had arrived. His first instinct was to run, to grab the child and retreat into the relative safety of the cabin, but he fought it down. Running would be an admission of guilt. He had done nothing wrong. He would not act like a thief. He held his ground, his posture calm, his hand gently stroking the baby's back. He would show them he was not a threat. He was a guardian. The riders on the ridge seemed to confer. Then 3 of them broke away from the main group and began to make their way down the long, winding path towards his ranch. They moved slowly, deliberately, not with the haste of an attack, but with the grim purpose of an inquest. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs. 3 warriors against 1 man. He had to think, what were his options? He could meet them with the Winchester in his hands, a show of force. But that would be suicide, an invitation to a battle he could not possibly win. It would also orphan the child for a second time in as many days. No, violence was not the answer. His only weapon was the truth. As the 3 riders drew closer, he could make out their features. The one in the center was clearly the leader. He was an older man, his face a mask of hard-won authority, his long hair streaked with gray. He wore a magnificent eagle feather war bonnet, a testament to his status. His eyes, even from a distance, looked like chips of black obsidian, hard and unforgiving. The 2 warriors flanking him were younger, their faces set in expressions of cold hostility, their hands resting on the rifles balanced across their laps. They stopped about 100 yards from the porch, a clear line drawn in the dust. The leader raised a hand, a signal to halt. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the buzz of a lone fly and the soft gurgle of the baby in Jacob's arms. The leader's gaze was fixed on the child. It was a look of intense, focused anger, but also of profound pain. This was a man who was grieving. Jacob knew he had to make the first move. He slowly, carefully stood up, keeping the baby cradled securely against his shoulder. He did not reach for his gun. He did not shout. He simply stood there, a lone white man holding a Comanche child, waiting. The leader dismounted, his movements fluid and powerful. He handed the reins of his horse to one of the younger warriors and began to walk towards the cabin. He walked alone, his hands empty at his sides, a gesture of both supreme confidence and a willingness to parley. It was also a test. How would the white man react? Jacob's mind raced. He had one chance, one moment, to turn this tide of suspicion. He had to communicate his innocence without a shared word between them. He thought of the mother's tracks, of the predator. He had to show them what had happened. He had to make them understand. As the chief approached, Jacob made his decision. He held the chief's gaze, and then slowly he lowered himself to one knee, a gesture of respect, of non-aggression. And then he held the baby out, an offering, a sacred trust being returned. It was the biggest gamble of his life. The Comanche war chief, whose name was Black Hawk, stopped 10 paces from the porch. His eyes, hard and ancient, took in the scene before him. He saw the white man, kneeling in the dust. He saw the pathetic offering of the child, his grandchild, wrapped in the white man's rough cloth. He saw the rifle leaning by the cabin door, a coiled snake waiting to strike. His heart was a cold, hard stone of grief and fury. His daughter, Mourning Dove, was gone. Her tracks had told the story. The flight, the predator, and then this. The tracks of the white man, the thief, overlapping hers, desecrating her last moments. His warriors on the ridge wanted blood. They wanted to burn this shack to the ground and reclaim the child from the ashes of the man who had stolen him. But Black Hawk was a chief. His fury was a tool, not a master. He needed to be certain. He needed to look into the eyes of the man who had brought this new sorrow to his people. He approached Jacob, his steps measured, his gaze unwavering. He saw no fear in the white man's eyes. He saw exhaustion, a deep, abiding sadness, and a strange kind of resolve. It was not the look of a common thief. Jacob held the baby out, his arms steady despite the tremor he felt in his soul. It was an act of complete and total surrender. He was placing the child's life, and his own, entirely in the chief's hands. He was trusting in a humanity he hoped they shared. Black Hawk stopped directly in front of him. He looked down at the baby, his grandson. The child was sleeping, his face peaceful, his belly full. He was clean. He was warm. This was not the work of a man who intended harm. A flicker of doubt, small and unwelcome, entered the chief's heart. He looked back at Jacob. His eyes were not just on the man, but on what was around him. He saw the small, makeshift wick of cloth lying on the porch step, still damp with milk. He saw the bucket of clean water. He saw the care. His gaze then fell on the baby's foot. A small, sharp mesquite thorn was embedded in the soft flesh of the heel, something the mother must have missed in her haste. A small circle of inflamed red skin surrounded it. As Black Hawk watched, Jacob, seeing where the chief was looking, gently took the baby's foot in his large hand. With his other hand he used his thumbnail, honed sharp for practical tasks, to delicately work the thorn loose. He did it with a surgeon's care, his touch surprisingly gentle. He extracted the thorn, and a single tiny bead of blood welled up. The baby whimpered in its sleep, but did not wake. Jacob then took the milky cloth and dabbed the tiny wound clean. This small, intimate act of care, performed under the threat of death, was more powerful than any words. It was a testament. It spoke of tenderness, of protection. Black Hawk's stony expression did not change, but the fury in his heart began to recede, replaced by a confusing mixture of gratitude and suspicion. Why would a white man, an enemy, show such care? He still did not understand. He reached out and took the baby from Jacob's arms. The child felt warm and solid. A piece of his lost daughter returned to him. He held his grandson close, a wave of fierce, protective love washing over him. The immediate danger to the child was over. Now the question of justice remained. He turned his gaze back to Jacob, who was still kneeling in the dust, his head bowed, awaiting his fate. Black Hawk spoke, his voice deep and resonant, the Comanche words rolling like stones. "You are a thief. You stole a child of the people." Jacob did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was an accusation. He looked up, meeting the chief's hard gaze. He had to make him understand. He pointed to the east, to the rocky ground where the tracks had vanished. Then he raised his hands and mimicked the claws of a large cat, a gesture of savage power. He made a sound, a low growl in his throat. He then pointed to himself, then to the baby, and then he shook his head emphatically, a universal gesture of denial. He pointed back to the thicket where he had found the child, and then he mimicked the act of cradling and soothing a crying infant. It was a crude pantomime, a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm of language and culture that separated them. The two younger warriors who had approached on foot watched with open contempt. One of them spat on the ground. "He lies, my chief," one of them said in Comanche. "He is trying to trick us. Let us kill him and be done." Black Hawk silenced him with a glance. He had seen the pantomime. He had also seen the truth in the man's eyes. The story the white man was telling matched the one the tracks had told. Up to a point. The tracks showed the predator. They did not show the outcome. His daughter could still be alive, wounded, hiding, or she could be gone. The hope was a poison. "Where is the mother?" Black Hawk asked, his voice sharp. Jacob, of course, did not understand. He could only look at the chief with a helpless, sorrowful expression. He knew what the chief was asking. He had no answer to give. The standoff was at a precipice. The truth was not enough. The chief needed his daughter, and Jacob could not produce her. The air crackled with tension. The lives of everyone present hung on the chief's next decision. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a new figure appeared. An old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her hair as white as winter snow, was walking from the main group of warriors on the ridge. She was the tribe's elder, a woman named Whispering Wind, and her authority was second only to Black Hawk's. She carried no weapon, only a walking stick, and the immense weight of her wisdom. She had seen the pantomime from the ridge. She had seen the white man kneel. She had seen her chief's hesitation. She knew that truth was often more complex than the sharp edge of a warrior's anger. She walked past the two young guards as if they were invisible and stopped beside Black Hawk. She did not look at Jacob. She looked only at the baby in her son-in-law's arms. She reached out a gnarled hand and gently touched the child's cheek. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her own. "He is whole," she said in the Comanche tongue, her voice soft but clear. "The son of my granddaughter is whole." She then looked at the white man, truly looked at him, her eyes holding a deep, penetrating wisdom that seemed to see right into Jacob's soul. She saw the grief that was etched into the lines of his face, a grief that mirrored their own. This was not a man who stole children. This was a man who had lost one. She bent down and picked up the small, milky strip of cloth from the porch step. She smelled it. Sweet milk. Not the sour goat's milk of the Mexicans, but the rich cow's milk of the whites. She saw the half-empty can of condensed milk just inside the cabin door. She saw the bucket of clean water. She saw the care, the evidence of a night spent in gentle vigil. "This man did not harm the child," she said, her voice firm. "He saved him. He fed him. He cleaned him. He kept him warm through the night. He fought the thorns for him." She gestured to the small, clean wound on the baby's heel. The two young warriors shifted uncomfortably. They had been so certain, so ready for blood. The elder's words were like water on the fire of their rage. Black Hawk listened, his proud face a mask of conflicting emotions. He wanted to hate this man. It would be easier. Hating him would give his grief a target. But the evidence and the elder's wisdom were undeniable. The white man had acted with honor. "His honor does not bring my daughter back," Black Hawk said, his voice thick with pain. "She may be alive, hurt. We must find her." Jacob watched this exchange, understanding nothing of the words but everything of the shifting dynamics. The arrival of the old woman had changed the temperature of the conflict. He saw the doubt in the chief's eyes, the softening of his hard expression. There was a chance. A slim one, but it was there. He knew he had to do more. He had to help them. He stood up slowly. He pointed again to the east, towards the rocky ground where the woman's tracks had disappeared. He then looked at the sun and pointed to where it had been yesterday morning and then where it was now, showing the passage of a full day. He then made a walking motion with his fingers, a sign for a search, a journey. He pointed to Black Hawk, to his warriors, and then to himself, and nodded and offered to join them, to help them find the mother. One of the young warriors scoffed. "He wants to lead us into a trap." But Whispering Wind saw the truth. "He offers his help," she said to Black Hawk. "A guilty man runs. An honorable man offers to share the burden of the search. Let him show us." Black Hawk was torn. To trust a white man, an enemy, went against every instinct, every lesson his hard life had taught him. But his daughter was out there. He had to swallow his pride, his hatred, if there was even the smallest chance of finding her alive. He made his decision. He turned to one of the warriors. "Give him his horse," he commanded. "He will ride with us, but if this is a trick, his death will be slow." He then turned to Jacob and gestured for him to get his horse, his meaning clear. "You will come with us." The warrior brought Daisy, her eyes wide with fear at the sight and smell of the Comanche war ponies. Jacob took the reins, his heart pounding. He was no longer a prisoner. He was a guide, an unwilling ally in a desperate search. He had bought himself a little more time, But as he mounted his horse, surrounded by the silent, hostile warriors of the Comanche, he knew he had only traded one kind of danger for another. He was now riding into the heart of their world, a world that would not hesitate to kill him if the search for Mourning Dove ended in anything but her safe return. The search party was a strange and silent procession. Jacob rode in the center, a prisoner in all but name, flanked by the two young warriors who watched his every move with open hostility. Black Hawk rode at the head, his back ramrod straight, a figure of grim authority. The elder, Whispering Wind, had taken the baby and returned to the main camp on the ridge, leaving the men to their grim task. They rode east, towards the unforgiving expanse of rock and scrub where Mourning Dove's tracks had vanished. Jacob led them to the spot, the place where the earth had swallowed her trail. The Comanche warriors dismounted, their eyes scanning the ground with an intensity that amazed Jacob. They were reading a language he could barely comprehend, a story told in broken twigs, displaced stones, and the faintest of scuff marks. He had thought the trail was gone. To them, it was merely difficult. For hours they moved, slowly, painstakingly, casting in wide circles, searching for any sign. The sun beat down on them, relentless and cruel. Jacob worked alongside them, his own tracking skills, learned from a lifetime on this land, feeling clumsy and inadequate in comparison. But he searched with a desperate intensity, knowing his life depended on their success. The warriors, seeing his genuine effort, began to thaw, their open hostility replaced by a grudging respect. He was not a lazy white man. He worked as hard as they did. Late in the afternoon, one of the warriors let out a sharp cry. He had found something. Tucked into the crevice of a rock, almost invisible, was a single blue bead, identical to the ones on the baby's buffalo head wrapping. It had likely fallen as Mourning Dove scrambled over the rocks. Hope, a fragile and dangerous thing, surged through the group. The trail was warm again. They followed the new line, their pace quickening. The tracks led them higher into a narrow, winding canyon. The walls rose steeply on either side, casting long, cool shadows. The air grew still, the silence profound. It was a place that felt ancient and sacred, but also claustrophobic and dangerous. A perfect place for an ambush. Jacob felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Daisy was nervous again, her ears twitching, her steps hesitant. The predator from yesterday was close. He could feel it. Black Hawk felt it too. He raised his hand, halting the party. The warriors drew their rifles, their eyes scanning the rocky ledges above. The silence was absolute. Then, from high above them came the sound of a rock clattering down the canyon wall. All eyes snapped towards the sound. On a ledge not 50 yards away stood the mountain lion. It was a magnificent, terrifying creature, larger than any Jacob had ever seen. Its tawny body was tense, its long tail twitching. Its yellow eyes stared down at them, filled with a cold, territorial fury, and behind it, half hidden in the shadows of a small cave, was the body of a young woman. Mourning Dove. She was not moving. Black Hawk let out a cry of pure agony, a sound that seemed to rip from the very depths of his soul. It was not a war cry. It was the sound of a father's heart breaking. The grief that he had been holding at bay washed over him, and in that moment, he was not a chief. He was just a man who had lost his child. The young warriors, seeing their chief's grief, raised their rifles, their rage given a clear and present target. They took aim at the cat. "No!" Jacob shouted, the word tearing from his throat. They didn't understand him, but his tone was urgent, desperate. He pointed not at the cat, but at the body behind it. Firing their rifles would be foolish. The bullets could ricochet in the narrow canyon. It could trigger a rock slide. And most importantly, it would desecrate the body of the woman they were trying to recover. Black Hawk, his eyes blurred with tears, looked at Jacob, a question in his agonized gaze. "Why?" Jacob knew he had to act. He slid from his horse, his Winchester in his hand. He didn't raise it to fire. Instead, he looked at Black Hawk and pointed to the chief's bow. The traditional weapon, silent, precise, a weapon of honor. He was telling him that this was not a task for the noisy, indiscriminate violence of the white man's gun. This was a moment that demanded the old ways. It was a moment for a chief to avenge his daughter with the weapon of his people. The young warriors lowered their rifles, confused. But Black Hawk understood. The white man was right. This was his duty. This was his right. He took the bow from his back, his movements filled with a new, terrible purpose. His grief was being channeled, forged into a deadly resolve. He nocked an arrow, his hands steady, his eyes, now clear of tears, fixed on the predator that had taken his daughter. It was a moment of profound, terrible silence, a hunter's last communion with his prey. The fate of the canyon and the fragile peace between two worlds rested on the strength of a single bowstring. Black Hawk drew the bowstring back, his powerful muscles bunching under his weathered skin. The motion was fluid, practiced, a deadly art form passed down through generations. The world narrowed to the space between his eye, the tip of the arrow, and the heart of the beast on the ledge. The mountain lion, sensing the shift from prey to predator, let out a low, guttural snarl. It crouched lower, its tail lashing, preparing to spring. Jacob and the other warriors stood frozen, witnesses to a primal drama of vengeance and grief. The bowstring twanged, a sound that was both sharp and deeply resonant in the canyon's silence. The arrow flew, a straight and silent messenger of death. It struck the mountain lion perfectly, just behind the shoulder, sinking deep into its chest. The great cat leaped into the air with a terrible, strangled cry, its body contorting in a paroxysm of agony. It clawed at the air, its magnificent power extinguished in an instant. It toppled from the ledge and fell, crashing onto the canyon floor with a sickening thud. It was over. Silence, heavy and profound, descended once more, but this was a different silence. It was the silence of finality, of an ending. Black Hawk stood motionless, the bow still held aloft, his gaze fixed on the still form of his daughter in the cave. The fire of his vengeance was spent, leaving only the cold gray ashes of his sorrow. He lowered the bow and walked towards the ledge, his steps heavy. The two young warriors moved to follow, but Jacob put a hand on the shoulder of the nearest one. He shook his head gently. This was a path the chief had to walk alone. The warrior, to Jacob's surprise, did not shrug him off. He stopped, his eyes filled with a new understanding, a shared sense of the sacredness of this moment. Together, in a silence that was no longer hostile but somber and respectful, the three men, two Comanche warriors and one white rancher, waited. They watched as the chief climbed the rocks, his movements sure and steady despite the burden of his grief. He disappeared into the small cave. For a long time there was no sound. Then a single, heartbreaking cry of mourning echoed through the canyon, the sound of a father weeping for his lost child. When Black Hawk emerged, he was carrying the body of Mourning Dove in his arms. She was wrapped in his own blanket, her face hidden from view. He carried her as if she weighed nothing, his steps careful and tender. He brought her down to the canyon floor and laid her gently on the ground. The warriors gathered around, their heads bowed, their faces masks of sorrow. Jacob stood back, giving them their space, his own heart aching in sympathy. He knew this grief. He had lived this grief. He was a stranger, an enemy, but in this moment, in this sacred circle of sorrow, they were all just men mourning a life taken too soon. Later, as the sun began to dip below the canyon walls, casting the world in shades of purple and gold, the warriors prepared a travois to carry Mourning Dove's body back to their camp. Black Hawk approached Jacob. The chief's face was a study in exhaustion, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. He looked at Jacob, and for the first time, there was no anger, no suspicion in his gaze. There was only a deep, weary sadness, and something else, respect. He spoke in his own tongue, but his gestures made his meaning clear. He pointed to Jacob, then to the east, towards his ranch. He was telling him he was free to go. His debt was paid. The search was over. He had proven his honor. Jacob nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He mounted Daisy, his body aching, his spirit drained. He had survived. He had earned his freedom. As he turned to leave, Black Hawk spoke again. He held up a hand, a gesture for him to wait. The chief reached into a small pouch at his belt and took something out. He walked over to Jacob and pressed it into his hand. It was a single, perfect eagle feather, its tip dyed red. Jacob knew enough of the Comanche ways to understand the significance of the gift. It was a mark of the highest honor, a symbol of courage and friendship, given from one warrior to another. To be given such a gift, from a chief who had every reason to kill him, was a gesture so profound it left him speechless. Jacob looked from the feather in his hand to the chief's weary face. He could see the immense cost of this gesture, the weight of the tradition and pride the chief was setting aside to acknowledge him. Jacob could only nod his thanks, his eyes conveying the gratitude he could not speak. He turned Daisy and rode away, not looking back. He rode out of the canyon of death, leaving the grieving tribe to their rituals, the feather clutched safely in his hand. He was returning to his silent cabin, to his empty life. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence he was returning to was not the same one he had left. It had been changed, forever. Jacob rode through the twilight, the world around him surreal and dreamlike. The landscape, once so familiar, felt alien, as if he were seeing it for the first time. He had journeyed into the heart of an enemy's world and had come back not just alive, but changed. He carried with him an eagle feather, a symbol of a bridge built across a chasm of hatred and misunderstanding. He was a man who had shared a moment of profound, human connection with those he was supposed to despise. When he finally saw his cabin, a single, dark shape against the star-dusted horizon, he felt a pang of loneliness so sharp it was a physical pain. He had returned the baby. He had helped find the mother. He had survived, but he was alone again. The silence that greeted him as he stepped inside was the old silence, the predatory one. It felt heavier now, more profound, after the brief, intense connection of the past day. The baby's presence lingered like a ghost. He saw the empty bed, the milk-stained cloth, the impression on the pillow where a small head had rested. The cabin felt hollow, empty, as if its heart had been ripped out. He had saved a child, only to be reminded of the child he had lost. The grief he had kept at bay for 3 years came roaring back, a tidal wave of sorrow. He sat down at his small wooden table, and for the second time in his life, he wept. He wept for Sarah and Daniel. He wept for Mourning Dove and her child. He wept for Black Hawk's loss. He wept for the profound, aching loneliness of his own existence. He fell into an exhausted, dream-filled sleep at the table, his head resting on his arms, the eagle feather still clutched in his hand. He dreamed of his son, Daniel, but in the dream, Daniel had the dark, almond-shaped eyes of the Comanche baby. He dreamed of Sarah, and she was smiling, her hand resting on the shoulder of a proud Comanche woman. The two women looked at him with the same expression of gentle approval. He awoke with a start, the first rays of dawn painting the cabin in soft gray light. The dreams were gone, but the feeling of them remained. A sense of peace, a sense of closure. He felt lighter. The crushing weight of his grief had eased, its sharp edges softened. He got up and made coffee, the familiar ritual a comfort. As he stood on his porch, watching the sunrise, he knew his life had been irrevocably altered. He was still alone, but he was no longer a prisoner of his solitude. He had looked into the face of his enemy, and had seen a fellow man, a grieving father. He had been given a gift of honor. He had a story to tell, even if only to himself. A week passed. Jacob fell back into the rhythm of his work, but the work felt different. It was no longer a penance, but a purpose. He was caring for his land, his home, with a renewed sense of stewardship. He was no longer just waiting to die. He was living. One afternoon, as he was repairing the corral fence, he saw a rider approaching. It was a lone rider, moving slowly, not with the urgency of a threat. As the rider drew closer, Jacob recognized him. It was Black Hawk. He was alone, not in his war bonnet, but in the simple attire of a hunter. He carried no rifle, only a long, cloth-wrapped object laid across his lap. Jacob put down his hammer and waited, his heart calm. There was no fear. Black Hawk rode right up to the fence and dismounted. He walked towards Jacob, his expression unreadable but not hostile. He stopped in front of Jacob and held out the long, wrapped object. It was a gift. Jacob took it, his hands trembling slightly. He carefully unwrapped the cloth. It was a bow, a magnificent Comanche hunting bow, exquisitely crafted from Osage orange wood, its grip wrapped in soft, tanned leather. Tucked into the wrapping was a quiver of arrows, each one perfectly fletched with hawk feathers. It was a gift of immense value, both practical and symbolic. It was the weapon of a provider, a hunter. It was a tool of life. Jacob looked up at Black Hawk, his eyes full of a question he didn't know how to ask. Why? Black Hawk spoke, and though Jacob did not understand the words, he understood the meaning. The chief gestured to the bow, then to the land, a gesture that encompassed the deer, the antelope, the life of the prairie. Then he pointed to Jacob, and then to his own heart. He was saying thank you. He was acknowledging their shared experience, the bond forged in the canyon of sorrow. Then the chief did something that stunned Jacob. He reached into a pouch and brought out a small, familiar object. It was the baby's buffalo hide wrapping, the one with the intricate beadwork. He unfolded it, and tucked inside was a small, crudely carved wooden horse, a child's toy. Jacob recognized his own clumsy handiwork. It was a toy he had carved for Daniel, one that had been buried with him. He stared at it, confused. Black Hawk gestured to the north, to the mission cemetery where Jacob's family was buried. He then made a digging motion. His warriors, in their grief, had gone to the white man's graveyard. Perhaps in anger, perhaps in a misguided search for answers. They had disturbed the grave, but instead of desecrating it, they had found this. They had seen the proof of the white man's loss. They had seen that he was, indeed, a man who had lost a child. Black Hawk laid the toy horse gently on top of the bow. He looked Jacob in the eye, and for the first time a flicker of something akin to a smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a look of complete and total understanding. They were two fathers, united by a grief that transcended race, language, and hatred. They were no longer enemies. They were brothers in sorrow. Jacob stood speechless, the weight of the bow in one hand and the impossibly light wooden horse in the other. This final gesture, this return of a piece of his own buried past, was more profound than the eagle feather, more meaningful than the bow. It was an act of grace. It was the closing of a circle. Black Hawk had not just come to give a gift. He had come to return a piece of Jacob's soul. He was acknowledging that Jacob's loss was as real and as valid as his own. In the silent language of fathers who have lost children, they had found a common ground, a sacred space where their shared humanity overshadowed a lifetime of enmity. Black Hawk nodded once, a gesture of finality and farewell. He turned, mounted his pony, and rode away, not looking back. He disappeared over the ridge, leaving Jacob alone once more, but an entirely different kind of alone. The silence that descended now was not the silence of ghosts and grief. It was a silence of peace, of contemplation. Jacob carried the gifts inside his cabin. He leaned the beautiful Comanche bow and quiver in the corner, a place of honor. He took the small wooden horse and placed it on the mantelpiece, right next to the eagle feather. They were his treasures, symbols of the strangest and most important 2 days of his life. The horse, a symbol of the son he had lost. The feather, a symbol of the son he had saved. In the years that followed, Jacob's life found a new rhythm. The ranch prospered, but its success was no longer the measure of his existence. He became a different kind of man, a man more attuned to the world around him. He learned to see the land not just as something to be owned and tamed, but as a living entity, full of stories and spirits. He never saw Black Hawk again, but sometimes he would find a fresh deer carcass left near his fence line, a silent gift from a hunting party that had passed in the night. In return, he would leave a sack of flour or a bag of coffee on a rock by the river, a silent offering of his own. It was a quiet, unspoken treaty, a friendship conducted across a vast and empty landscape. He remained alone, but his loneliness was no longer a wound. It was a quiet space, filled with memory and a deep, abiding peace. He had faced the abyss of his grief and had not been consumed. He had reached out a hand to a helpless child and had, in turn, been pulled back into the world of the living. The story of the widowed cowboy and the Comanche baby was never told. It existed only in the heart of one man, in the memory of a tribe, and in the 3 objects that sat on a dusty mantelpiece in a lonely cabin: a toy horse, an eagle feather, and the profound silence of a man who had found his peace, not by forgetting his past, but by having the courage to face it and to honor the humanity he found in the heart of his enemy. He had learned that a man's true wealth is not the land he owns or the cattle he raises, but the honor he keeps and the grace he is willing to extend even and especially to those who are supposed to be his foes. The silence on Jacob's ranch was no longer a predator, it was a friend.